If I told you there's research showing that higher intelligence and more education are linked to more left-leaning political beliefs, what story would you tell yourself about that? Does it mean that one side is smarter than the other? That conservatives are less educated? Or is the truth way more complicated, nuanced, and interesting than that headline suggests? In this episode, we're going to unpack what those studies actually say, how personality traits shape whether you lean conservative or liberal, and how both sides, under the wrong conditions, can slide into authoritarian thinking. And because this is built to grow, we're not stopping at theory. We're going to talk about what this means for your own personal development, how to better understand your own wiring, how to protect yourself from authoritarian pulls, and how to keep growing no matter where you fall on the political spectrum. Welcome back to Built to Grow. I'm your host, Valdet, and this show is all about using psychology and self-awareness to build a life and a world that actually grows. Today, we're taking on a topic that sits right at the intersection of politics, psychology, and personal growth. How intelligence, education, and personality traits relate to our political beliefs and how all of that connects to authoritarianism. Here's a couple of important caveats I just want to give up front. Today we're talking about patterns in large groups. So we're not diagnosing individual people. We're just looking at patterns in large groups. I also want to be clear, we'll talk about correlation. Correlation does not mean destiny, and it does not mean moral worth. Being higher or lower in any trait does not make you a better or worse human. And then authoritarianism is not exclusive to one side. There can be left-wing and right-wing versions, and we'll talk about both. But we do tend to see it more in right wing, and we'll explore that as well. But the goal here isn't to dunk on one political tribe. It's to give you a clearer map of these psychological forces that are at play, so that you can just better understand your own instincts and your own blind spots. Recognize when any movement, including the ones you agree with, starts drifting into authoritarian territory. And then use personal growth practices to stay grounded, to stay curious, and become harder to manipulate. Okay, so let's jump into it. So what do we actually know about intelligence, education, and political ideology? So there's a number of studies, including one that is summarized by Futurism. There's this article that was posted on Futurism that links to a study, but they found a statistical link between higher measured intelligence or more years of education and more liberal or left-leaning beliefs on certain issues. So let's talk about it. Typically, intelligence in these studies usually means performance on cognitive tests, problem solving, pattern recognition, verbal reasoning, and then education usually means how many years of schooling you completed or what degree you've earned. When researchers look at large samples, they often find that people who score higher on these measures are somewhat more likely, on average, to support things like LGBTQ rights, gender equality, and multiculturalism. They tend to be way more comfortable with immigration and diversity, and they endorse practices that reduce inequality. But there are also three big things we have to keep in mind. We're talking about averages, not absolutes. So there are highly intelligent conservatives and less educated liberals, and vice versa. And the overlap between the groups is pretty huge. Intelligence tests themselves are narrow. They capture some kinds of problem solving, but not wisdom, empathy, or moral judgment. And there's actually about 7 different types of intelligence. So there's social intelligence, there's music intelligence, there's spatial intelligence. So An intelligence test doesn't always capture the range of intelligence that exists. And then when it comes to education, education is an experience, not just a number. So spending years in environments that expose you to different cultures, ideas, and people tends to increase your comfort with complexity and difference. This can lean you left on social issues regardless of your raw IQ score. Exposure to others is known to make people more inclusive. So instead of telling ourselves a story like smart people are liberal and dumb people are conservative, a more accurate and more respectful story would be something like people who are educated or score higher on certain cognitive tests are slightly more likely to hold left-leaning views on some issues, partly because of the kinds of environments, information, and social circles that they move through. Now that's interesting, but that's not the whole story. To really understand why people land where they do politically, we also have to talk about the role of personality. So let's bring in what is known as the Big Five personality traits, one of the most studied ways that psychologists describe our default settings. So there are 5 personality traits. There's openness to experience. So this is often how curious, imaginative, and comfortable we are with novelty. Then there's conscientiousness, which is how orderly, disciplined, and rule-oriented you are. We have extroversion, which is how energized you are by social interaction and stimulation. Then there's agreeableness. This is how you prioritize harmony, empathy, and getting along. And then neuroticism, also known emotional sensitivity. This is how strongly you experience negative emotions like anxiety or a threat. Again, to be clear, research is about probabilities, not boxes, but some patterns show up consistently. People who score higher on openness tend to be more liberal or progressive, especially on cultural and social issues. They are more comfortable with change, diversity, and complexity. People who score higher in conscientiousness, especially the order and duty sides of it, they tend to lean more conservative. They value tradition, stability, and clear rules. Now, there's a sensitivity here to threat and danger, which overlaps with parts of neuroticism, with a separate trait called threat sensitivity. And this can push people towards stronger law and order, security-focused positions. And you can already see the outlines of these two instinctive stories about the world. If you are high in openness, you might see the world as something to explore, update, progress, experimentation, and inclusion feel exciting. But if you're high in consciousness and threat sensitivity, you might see the world as something fragile that needs protecting and preserving, order, tradition, and clear boundaries that feel safe. Now, none of these are inherently good or bad. They're different ways of responding to the same reality. A healthy society probably needs both. People pushing for needed change and people asking, wait, what do we lose if we move too fast? But those same traits under pressure can also lead or feed into something that is much darker. So let's zoom out from the traits to the bigger stories like liberals and conservatives often tell about the world. Very broadly, I'm totally oversimplifying this. You can think of it like liberal worldviews tend to prioritize equality, inclusion, and change. They're more comfortable with fluid identities, shifting norms, and questioning old hierarchies. Conservative worldviews tend to prioritize stability, order, and tradition. They put more weight on preserving institutions, honoring inherited wisdom, and respecting authority and hierarchy. Again, these are tendencies, they're not strict categories. But they do come with strengths and they do come with shadows. Like on the liberal side, strengths could include compassion for marginalized groups, willingness to question unjust systems, and openness to new ideas and ways of living. But the shadows of that could be underestimating the value of stability and shared norms, being so focused on change that you lose people who need a sense of continuity, and then turning moral outrage into purity tests that no one can pass. On the conservative side, there are strengths: protecting institutions that actually do work, valuing responsibility, duty, and loyalty, and remembering that not all change is automatically progress. But there are some shadows too. The shadows might include things like over-idealizing the past and ignoring who was excluded from it, using order to justify injustice, and being so afraid of chaos that you shut down necessary reforms. Now, under healthy conditions, these tensions can be productive. One side pushes for change, the other stress tests it for unintended consequences. But under unhealthy conditions, especially when fear and humiliation enter the picture, both sides can drift towards authoritarianism. So what I mean when I say authoritarianism, in psychology, authoritarianism usually refers to a style of thinking or relating that includes things like a strong preference for hierarchy and obedience over equality and autonomy, desire for a strong leader who will use force if necessary to restore order, intolerance of dissent, seeing agreement as disloyalty, and then willingness to dehumanize outgroups or justify harsh treatment for the quote-unquote greater good. Most people are familiar with right-wing authoritarianism, the militant nationalism, rigid traditionalism, and hostility towards perceived outsiders. This is something we're seeing a lot of in this country right now. That's why it's very important that we're talking about it. But researchers have also described left-wing authoritarianism, where the content of the beliefs is progressive, but the style is harshly punitive. It's intolerant of dissent and comfortable with silencing opponents. I've also seen this too, as well. But what tends to feed authoritarianism, regardless of the left or the right, is a mix of things like high threat and uncertainty. Things like economic crises, rapid social change, terrorism, pandemics. Also strong in-group loyalty. People like us are under attack. We see this a lot also as well. And then low psychological tolerance for ambiguity. People needing simple, black and white answers, which this also leads to radicalization. So if you listen to one of my previous episodes where we talk about the psychology of radicalization, these things contribute to people becoming radicalized as well. Now let's connect this back to personality traits. If you're less comfortable with ambiguity, if you're higher in threat sensitivity and really value order, authoritarian messages can feel like relief. Finally, someone will take charge and make things simple again, or make things great again. If you're high in moral outrage and you feel like the status quo is violently unjust, authoritarian tactics on your side can also start to feel justified. We're on the right side of history. So these harsh measures, they're necessary. Actually, in both cases, the pattern looks similar. You feel afraid, humiliated, or out of control. Someone offers a simple story with a clear villain and a strong leader. You start to see people who disagree not just as wrong, but as dangerous. You become more okay with extreme measures to fix the problem. Things like censorship, political violence, removing rights from certain groups. That's the authoritarian slide. And notice, none of this requires you to be unintelligent. In fact, if you're highly intelligent but emotionally unregulated, you might be better at rationalizing whatever your tribe already believes. So the question isn't which side is smart. The question is, given my traits and my environment, what kind of political style am I vulnerable to, and how do I grow beyond that? This is where personal growth comes in. You can't change your basic wiring overnight. It is natural. If you're naturally high in openness or conscientiousness, that's not going anywhere. But you can build skills that act like shock absorbers, so you're less likely to drift into these authoritarian patterns and more likely to use your traits in a healthy way. So let's talk about some of those. 1, self-awareness of your political home base is important. Ask yourself, when I look back at my life, what kind of political messages have always felt intuitively right to me? More change-oriented or more order-oriented? In conflict, do I instinctively want to slow down and preserve stability, or speed things up and push for transformation? Just naming that home base helps you see, this is my starting point, not the objective. This is not a neutral view of the universe. This is where I'm at. Number 2, building tolerance for ambiguity. Authoritarian movements feed on the promise of simple answers. And you can practice resisting that by deliberately reading or listening to thoughtful people you disagree with, not the worst caricatures of the other side. Which sometimes we get caught up in the extremists of groups, and we have to just kind of find the people that we care about who also disagree. That's a good place to start. You also want to, notice when you feel the urge to say, it's just this one thing, instead of asking, what else might be true here? And then also practicing phrases like, I'm not sure yet. I need more information. I don't know about that. Even when it feels uncomfortable. 3, emotional regulation and nervous system work. A lot of authoritarian pull shows up in the body first. Tight chest, clenched jaw, racing thoughts. Simple practices here include things like pause before you share or repost something that scares you or enrages you. Just take 3 slow, deep breaths. Notice, where's this landing in my body before you decide what it means politically? You got to sit with what is happening before you post. And then have at least one friend you can process emotions with before you go post about them. When your nervous system is less hijacked, your intelligence and your values have more room to operate. Number 4, also consider intellectual humility. Listen, if you're highly educated or very online, it's easy to start believing we're the smart ones. We see the truth. They're just ignorant. Humility sounds more like, given my background and my traits, here's how the world looks to me, but I might be missing pieces. Or even saying, people on the other side are often responding to real fears and needs, even if I disagree with their solutions. Or I've even learned to say to myself, my reality is not their reality. They just don't experience the world like I do because they're not me and I'm not them. Humility doesn't mean you never take a stand. It means you remember that you're human and that intelligence can be used to justify almost anything. And actually, highly intelligent people are more likely or more able to justify things because they will overthink it. Number 5, use your traits as strengths. We all have them. So whatever your traits are, they all have a healthy expression. High openness can help you imagine better futures and be inclusive of other people, as long as you don't lose contact with practical reality. But if you're high in consciousness, that can also help you build stable institutions and keep commitments, as long as you don't weaponize rules and structures against people. And people who are high in agreeableness can help you build bridges, as long as you also set boundaries when needed. So personal growth is about aiming your traits on purpose instead of letting fear and group pressure aim them for you. And also, speaking about current events, I read somewhere that folks that are more conservative, they tend to be more religious, and people who are religious tend to lean towards authoritarianism because the structure of organized religion and authoritarianism are actually the same. There are leaders, you don't question authority. Authority is everything. If you speak up, you can't challenge them. You can't ask questions. And so there's a correlation between religion and authoritarianism. And then equally, people who are more secular or don't believe in God or religion tend to be more, they tend to oppose fascism and authoritarianism. So there is a very strong correlation in sociology with openness, high in openness, low in openness, high in conscientious, low in conscientious, religion. They're all related. But let's land this. Let's close this out here. I started with this provocative headline, right? Smarter and more educated people tend to lean left. And what we've seen is that the reality is far more nuanced. Intelligence and education do correlate with certain political beliefs, but they don't necessarily determine your worth, character, or even your exact ideology. Personality traits like openness and conscientiousness tilt us toward different political stories, change versus stability, equality versus hierarchy, and both have roles to play. Now, under pressure, both liberal and conservative movements can slide into authoritarianism when fear, humiliation, and simplicity take over. The hopeful part is this. You're not just a bundle of traits and test scores. You're a person who can grow. So here's your invitation this week. I want you to take a few minutes to just journal on this question. What kind of political story feels most natural to me? And how might my traits be shaping that? Notice one moment, online or offline, when you feel the fear or outrage. And instead of immediately reacting, pause, breathe, and ask, what else might be true here? And then have one curious conversation with someone who doesn't share all of your views, where the goal is not to win, but to understand what fear or value is underneath their position. Hey, if this episode helped you see yourself or politics a little bit more clearly, consider sharing it with a friend, especially with someone who thinks differently but is also committed to growth. And if you want more conversations like this that sit at the intersection of psychology, power, personal development, hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode of Built to Grow.